Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a very unusual and somewhat exciting discovery that essentially confirms that the early solar system was a lot more crowded than we ever thought, and was also a much more violent place that basically ended up destroying quite a lot of smaller planets. Or in other words, that in the early solar system there was very likely a lot more planets that no longer exist because they eventually got destroyed through various collisions. Or possibly got kicked out by larger planets and are now traveling somewhere across the Milky Way. And though today we mostly focus on the existing 8 planets, based on a recent study and a tiny piece of rock discovered in the Sahara Desert, we now have definitive evidence of a massive, long-lost world that once orbited the Sun, but no longer does. Essentially, we're looking at evidence of a complete planetary destruction. And in this case, all of this was discovered by studying the chemistry of this relatively rare meteorite, which allowed scientists to reconstruct what this unusual planet was potentially like. And so in this video, let's discuss some of the evidence and some of the discoveries, but also compare this to some of the other hypothetical propositions, such as the Planet 9 or the fifth giant. And of course discuss what this tells us about planetary formation and star system development. But before we start, let's discuss the meteorite and its initial discovery. And all of this starts in the Sahara Desert. Here, a discovery of Northwest Africa 12774 turned out to be very unusual. This was an extremely rare meteorite, commonly referred to as an Angelich, a meteorite that usually kind of resembles something like this. And normally most of them are characterized by their distinct mineral composition, mostly involving aluminium and titanium bearings, and certain minerals such as anorthite and troilite. But the reason they're so scientifically significant is because these are essentially some of the oldest igneous rocks, and also they seem to contain crystallization that very likely began 4.56 billion years ago. In other words, when it comes to meteorites, this is as old as it gets. And while scientists today are not entirely certain what parent body they came from, today it's actually believed that whatever created them was catastrophically destroyed, sometimes during the early development of the solar system. But they are rare, and only 30 known specimens exist today. And interestingly, all of these specimens actually resemble a lot of terrestrial minerals quite a lot. In other words, whatever object they were created by seems to have been some kind of a large terrestrial body. But once again, out of 80,000 meteorites, we only have 68. So this is basically as rare as it gets. Although realistically, the most interesting fact about them is that these are the oldest volcanic rocks, and in most cases completely untouched by anything, because since their formation, they were essentially in outer space, traveling between planets. But unlike rocks from Earth and Mars, they also usually only contain very little silica, which is on Earth one of the primary ingredients for rocks. Which is of course how we know that these are not from Earth and have to have come from a different body. But when it comes to this particular sample, NWA 12774, here there was also something that was kind of impossible for a small asteroid. In this case, Dr. Aaron Bell from CU Boulder has now discovered very strange crystals referred to as clinopyroxenes, and something that was also enriched in aluminium. Alright, in layman terms, he found crystals that can only form under extreme pressures, usually at least 7.5 kilobars, or basically pressures at least 17 times higher than on the bottom of the Mariana Trench. And we generally know that no asteroid produces such pressures, which means that the formation of these crystals must have been from something else. In other words, it suggested that wherever this meteorite came from was probably an object that was able to produce more pressure and thus very likely had relatively high gravity. And so the point of this recent study was to essentially try to figure out what conditions were required to produce these crystals, because this would tell us about the parent body just a little bit more. With the calculations now suggesting that the body in this case must have been at least 1,000 kilometers in radius, and possibly even larger, approximately 1800 kilometers, or 3600 kilometers in diameter, which is just a little bit bigger than the moon. Which is actually really interesting because it means that this object was at least moon-sized or even Mars-sized, and was extremely likely geologically active because, once again, these are volcanic rocks. Or at least it was volcanically active when it was finally destroyed. And so right now this provides us with the best evidence we have for the existence of a relatively massive, long-lost protoplanet that existed in the early solar system and then got completely destroyed through some kind of a collision with something else. And that means that all of these 68 Angeles known to us came from the same object, orbiting the solar system for 4.5 billion years before crashing on Earth. In other words, unlike previous propositions that these meteorites came from smaller asteroids, cannot possibly explain the formation of these crystals. These clinopyrrocene crystals can only form in high pressures and thus very likely formed inside a somewhat large volcanic planet, which basically confirms some of the initial propositions and of course some of the observations we've seen from other star systems that suggest that the early solar system and early star systems in general are extremely chaotic, basically containing these large planetary embryos, or these protoplanets, that grow pretty large pretty quick, but then eventually get destroyed through continuous collisions. And as we've discussed in one of the videos from a few months back, we've actually now seen this directly multiple times. As a matter of fact, at least one star system known to us has now experienced 2 such collisions in a single decade. This is the famous Fomalhaut system that's now experienced 2 such events. And while interestingly, in terms of the size of the objects colliding here, they're actually kind of similar in size, around 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers in diameter. And that of course suggests that a lot of these early planets generally follow an evolutionary path fundamentally different from terrestrial planets we see today. As a matter of fact, they most likely served as a kind of a building block for planets like Earth, Mars, Venus, and Mercury that the solar system eventually created, while also providing very important confirmation for the famous giant impact hypothesis, or basically the collision between early Earth and Theia, which was also potentially very similar in size. Although right now we don't think that these meteorites came from Theia because the composition is just generally pretty different. And so now we know that Theia is not the only ghost planet, or not the only destroyed planet, but there's definitely evidence for at least one more. Right now this one though doesn't have a name. Although here I also have to briefly mention that this idea of hypothetical planets is of course not new. As a matter of fact, historically, astronomers even proposed that a planet called Phaethon potentially explained the existence of the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and basically its destruction created the asteroid belt. But today we know that this is unlikely to have been the case, because the asteroid belt does not have enough mass, and likely never formed a planet because the Jupiter's mass was just a little bit too high and it continuously disrupted its formation. Then we of course have the propositions for the mysterious Planet 9 that we've also discussed in previous videos. Nothing new has been discovered about its existence or non-existence. But there is also the mysterious Planet 5, or the 5th giant, that scientists believe might have existed early on, but that was lost 4 billion years ago, either crashing into the Sun or possibly escaping because of the interaction with Jupiter and Saturn. And the reason scientists believe there was a 5th giant is because of the current architecture in the solar system that can only be explained if a lot of planets moved over time. And that motion was most likely the result of that 5th planet that no longer exists. This is actually a pretty well-known hypothesis, and it's technically known as the Nice model. It describes the migration of planets and the disappearance of that 5th giant. But, once again, NWA 12774 provides a physical proof that these large early worlds were not just mathematical simulations, but were definitely real, with this meteorite preserving a completely different pathway for how planets can develop using ingredients that are not present on Earth or Mars we see today. Although, because this is just the first study, there is really not much else we know about this planet, or if the other Angelich meteorites also came from the same object as well. Although at the same time it implies that some of the models of planetary formation also have to be basically reworked just a little bit. Because unlike previous assumptions, planet formation was not just a simple linear process involving rocks growing larger and sticking together, but potentially involved massive collisions that happened over and over, just like we've seen in the Fomalhaut system since 2004. As a matter of fact, it's quite possible that many minerals that exist on Earth today, and even the overall structure of planet Earth, possibly formed as a result of these multiple collisions that eventually started to coalesce into very specific planets that would actually be very different if these collisions were different as well. And that's because the materials that we actually see inside this lost world are fundamentally different from anything we've seen on Earth or on Mars. In other words, these early minerals were extremely different and very likely required a lot of chemical processes and seem to have transformed dramatically, possibly because of these multiple collisions over time, which I guess suggests that the early solar system was kind of experimenting with different types of planetary recipes, although most planets obviously did not survive. In the end, we only got 4 terrestrial planets and 4 gas planets. But in terms of science, this also reminds us that there's still a lot of work for us to do right here on Earth. As Dr. Bell mentions, even today there are many meteorites just sitting in drawers that have not been actually analyzed using these modern techniques and potentially hide a lot of different secrets about these ancient worlds. In other words, many of these meteorites might have come from a lot of similar objects involving these large planets. And so for all we know, many of these meteorites contain evidence of dozens of these protoplanets just waiting to be identified. Although just as a side note and as a fun fact, I also wanted to briefly mention the now disproven hypothesis about Vulcan, that other small terrestrial planet that 19th century astronomers believed existed very close to the Sun, because it was the only way they could explain why Mercury's orbit did not actually fit Newtonian predictions. And this example is kind of important to remember because sometimes these hypothetical propositions can be easily explained by new theories. Because just a few years after this initial proposition, Albert Einstein was able to disprove this and was able to explain all of this with the newly formed theory of general relativity. It explained Mercury's orbit through the frame-dragging effect from the Sun and did not require any extra planets. And so here I guess it's a kind of an important reminder that sometimes we just don't really have certain explanations yet, which means that even in this case, there might still be some alternative explanations. So in this case, only time will tell if this is indeed a remnant of an ancient planet. But with more evidence, and specifically geochemical evidence, we'll definitely have certain conclusions. And so in summary, the history of the solar system is definitely much more dynamic and much more chaotic than any previous standard models. And today, astronomy has moved from these hypothetical planets like Phaethon or Vulcan into physical understanding involving chemical reactions and propositions in regards to planets like Theia, and in this case, this unnamed world, this Angelich parent body. And so the discoveries from this tiny meteorite from Africa is opening a completely new window into the history of the solar system and is potentially opening a new field of astroarchaeology that will help us understand the formation of the solar system just a little bit better. On that note, once we get more data and more studies, we'll come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.